"Pardon," said the little boy, and ran away. I walked back toward Monsieur Barthélemy's shop a little way with my companion, because I had one more call to make. There used to be a Madame Rocagel, who kept a cleaning and pressing shop on the Avenue Kléber. I had taken my suits there to be pressed in 1918 and 1919, and I had always liked her. She was gracieuse, and she complimented me on my ungainly French, and I used to stay and try it out on her. She had been then a woman of perhaps 50. Her daughter, a pretty girl of 14, had helped her in the shop, studying English in her spare time and practicing it on me once in a while when I called and found her alone. I had dropped in to see Madame Rocagel and Marie in 1925, and Madame had been there, but her daughter was away. Now once again I found Madame alone, very gray, 70, as gracious as ever, still carrying on. We talked about the old days. She assured me my French was remarkable. Perhaps she meant incroyable. I asked about Marie. Had she married? Oh, mais non. Marie was out somewhere shopping or reading a book in a park. Madame asked me to have a glass of Malaga with her, but I was running out of phrases, so I left with my best bow. Marie, I calculated on my way back toward the Place de l'Étoile, must be all of 33 now. I wondered if she was still pretty. I wondered how good her English was after 19 years. 33. It was difficult to think of her as anything except the eager, dark-eyed little girl of 14 who used to try so hard, so blushingly, and with such a charming accent to say the way I said it. 33. I found myself getting leg-weary, and I hailed a cab before I got to the arch. Paris, I thought as I climbed into the cab, may never change, as the saying goes, but people do. I'm not as young as I once was myself. La Grande Ville de Plaisir. There is an old saying that if Paris had a street like Canebière, it would be a little Marseille, to which I shall add that if Marseille had a Promenade des Anglais, it would be a little Nice. Marseille is famous for the dark dangers of its back streets and for mysterious doings along its waterfront. Just the other day, boxes containing 6,000 gold watches in transit from Geneva to Buenos Aires were eased of their treasure and magically filled with chunks of cement on a quay in Marseille. You may have read about that. The police news of Marseille has a habit of getting on the international press wires. The activities of lawbreakers in Nice, on the other hand, may often be read about only in the local papers, of which my favorite is the enormously interesting L'Éclaireur de Nice et du Sud-Est. The voleurs of Nice take as a rule one watch at a time, or one wallet, but they frequently manage it in a picturesque fashion. If you should see a fat and jovial priest drop a well-filled billfold behind him on the promenade, return it to him, bow politely, wink, and proceed on your way. Tarry not to make an acquaintance that will show rapid signs of ripening into a pleasant and perhaps profitable companionship. The dropped wallet is the opening move in an ancient swindle that works like a charm in this friendly climate. When I was in Nice 12 years ago, the wolves in priests' clothing, sometimes it was in the clothing of retired philanthropists or bankers, reaped, as the saying goes, a rich harvest. I remember a professor of economics in a Pennsylvania college who waited for 3 hours in a cafe for his old pal, the priest, to show up. This particular variant of the venerable racket had begun with a most interesting talk about faith in one's fellow man, and had ended by the professor agreeing to prove his own faith in his fellow man by allowing the priest to walk around the block with the professor's wallet. Usually the old game is worked with considerably more subtlety. Often several enjoyable weeks drift by before the Holy Father or the philanthropist or the banker feels the fruit is ripe enough for the plucking. Always in the end, a gentleman of great faith is left sitting in a cafe or a hotel room, looking anxiously at his wristwatch, unless, of course, he has lent that to his good friend, too. In the winter of 1925, the Riviera edition of the Chicago Tribune, for which I was a reporter, ran every day on its front page a warning about the swindlers. It didn't seem to do much good. The general run of waywardness in Nice may be on a lesser scale than that of Marseille, but it is infinitely more fascinating. Inconnus are found mysteriously injured, malheureux get into all kinds of curious difficulties, and délicats are found wandering around with nothing on. If you have to keep your ear to the ground and your eye to the éclaireur to learn about them, it is partly because Nice is a carnival city whose daily news is drowned in a trumpeting of ballyhoo and a showering of confetti. The Syndicat d'Initiative and the Rotary Club, surely the strongest outside the United States, and the other organizations that go in for rosy pictures of this Grande Ville de Plaisir, dwell so loudly on the climate and the carnival that the casual visitor would not imagine anything out of the way ever happened here. And yet, like another Poictesme, it is a place in which almost anything is more than likely to happen. The night I arrived in the city, recently, a malheureux ran across the Place Masséna, bleeding copiously from a cut throat and gurgling, "Je vais mourir." He didn't die, however. The next night, a man scurried past me, hotly pursued by a woman who kept screaming, "Police!" Nobody paid any attention. It is always with a sense of high expectation that I set out into the city. If the day's excitement doesn't break actually about my head, I can always read about it in the éclaireur. At 2:30 yesterday afternoon, I see by the paper before me, in the Rue Bala, an Algerian named Tayeb Mihoubi was stabbed by a Moroccan named Mohammed Ben Mohammed. One Madame Groccherini, having irked a gentleman named Valerio Franchi, was slashed by the gentleman's knife, and when a Monsieur Ricci rashly intervened, he was slashed too. Knives rise and fall on this lovely littoral as easily and for as little provocation as a woman's tears. There are thousands of Italians and Corsicans in Nice, and a great gathering of Algerians, Moroccans, and somber dark men from a dozen other countries. The city has been a place of sojourn and foray ever since it was founded by the Phoenicians 20 centuries ago. It has been overrun by Ligurians, Celts, Romans, Saracens, Englishmen, and Americans. It has a tradition of restlessness. One of the most remarkable manifestations of the restlessness of Nice and the surrounding country is the bagarre. Bagarre means violent disorder, uproar, crush, squabble, scuffle, fray. Today's éclaireur tells of the final disposition in the courts of a famous bagarre, more exactly known as La Fusillade de la Place Arson, which took place as long ago as August 1936. The wheels of justice turn slowly in the South. As is usually the case with bagarres, nobody knows exactly how or why this one started, but it had something to do with politics. In the end, scores of men were involved, and more than 200 shots were fired. Nobody was killed or even seriously injured, which the éclaireur admits it is at a loss to understand, and so am I. Most of the shooting took place at close quarters. There must have been a kind of carnival touch about so much spectacular and aimless gunfire. Anyway, the case has been finally disposed of. 8 men were fined 25 francs each, or less than $1, for illegal possession of firearms. That was all. The éclaireur intimates that it was not considered discreet to prosecute the defendants on any more serious or relevant charges. Such a procedure, one gathers, could easily start a bagarre all over again, perhaps right there in the courtroom. Of recent bagarres, the one that has interested me most took place in a village a few miles from Nice, but since it was of the very scheme and rhythm of many a similar happening within the city limits, I must report it. It will give you as clear an idea as may be had of what a bagarre is like. The éclaireur launches into the puzzling story in this manner. In spite of promises given, in spite of appeals for calm, the closing of the Institute of Actinology was not accomplished without incident. I do not know what an Institute of Actinology is or why it should be difficult to close one without incident. Probably anywhere else in the world it would be child's play to close an Institute of Actinology. But not in Nice or vicinity. It was the Messrs. Mandouche, Guénon, and Billet, and a Madame Varane who tried to close this one. Monsieur Guénon was immediately set upon by a young man named Roba, who was accompanied by the Messrs. Lanteri, Bernardi, and Grindou. Monsieur Roba beat Monsieur Guénon savagely about the head, either with a rock or a poing américain, brass knuckles. A.M. Monti drifted into the scuffle from somewhere, rescued Monsieur Guénon, and took him to a doctor, who bandaged his wounds. Afterward, Monsieur Guénon went to a café run by a Monsieur Longuier, and was having a glass of something to steady his nerves when one Vincent Martino entered, saw the injured man's bandages, and asked him what had happened. Before he could get a reply, Monsieur Martino was punched in the head by Monsieur Barraquot. From here on, the story loses its sharp clarity. Monsieur Martino whipped out a gun, but hastily hid it in a cardboard box when a policeman entered. Monsieur Guénon and Monsieur Barraquot drop quietly out of the tortured narrative at this point, but Monsieur Martino was led off to the police station. That didn't cause things to quiet down. A crowd of 300 people gathered about the cafe, says the éclaireur, shouting and gesticulating. Women mingled in the crowd, also shouting and gesticulating. Presently, some cops shouldered their way through the mob, not to restore order, it turns out, but to hunt for Monsieur Martino's gun, which the first agent had neglected to seize. They found the gun and went away. The crowd stayed and grew increasingly menacing as the night wore on, so that Monsieur Laugier finally had to close the cafe. We learned that the police investigations went on late into the night, but just what angles of the involved case they were investigating is not made clear. I have an idea, though. They were concentrating on Monsieur Martino's gun. The éclaireur ends the story with this musical sentence: Dans la rue, le calme est long à revenir. That, then, is a typical bagarre, violent, cloudy, complicated. It is no use trying to fit the incidents together into a logical pattern. The éclaireur and the police gave that up long ago, and so did I. There is an embarrassing richness of clippings before me, cut from the éclaireurs of only 1 week. Several standing headlines recur frequently, one of them the simple phrase, les pochards. A pochard is a drunk. The headline has something of the slangy, sardonic force of among the soused, or with the cockeyed. The stories deal briefly with the activities of gentlemen who, while in their cups, have caused a slight scandal here, a mild outrage there. Another headline, Les conducteurs imprudents et maladroits, tops almost every day a considerable list of automobile accidents. I note that just yesterday, a big Hispano-Suiza sports roadster, driven by a baron, knocked down a lamp-post on the Promenade des Anglais, and that shortly afterward, another imprudent knocked down a palm tree. The promenade is more dangerous than the Place de la Concorde. I remember that when I was here before, the éclaireur ran a picture of a promenade traffic cop who was in the hospital for no less than the 7th time as the result of having been knocked down by a motorist on that broad thoroughfare. My clippings deal with a dozen other varied and spectacular episodes, but I shall go into detail only about the curious case of Monsieur Antoine Semeria, aged 47, a mécanicien dentiste, because it is typical of a special class of bizarre goings-on in this paradise on the Bay of Angels. Monsieur Semeria was dragged up before Monsieur Giocanti, commissaire of police, because he had refused to pay his fare on an autobus. He explained to the commissaire that it was his invariable custom not to pay for riding on autobuses. Ride on them he would, pay he would not, and that was that, the commissaire would see. Monsieur Giocanti listened patiently for a while, and then directed that Monsieur Semeria be put away in a hospital for observation. Monsieur Semeria was placed in the hospital, escaped immediately, boarded the first bus that came along, once more refused to pay, and was hauled up before the commissaire again before you could say Giocanti. I have touched on only 1 or 2 special phases of the rich life of this great, colorful city of almost 250,000 inhabitants, not counting the visitors, who nearly double the permanent population, that sprawls between the mountains and the sea. Up on the hill, back of the town, is the old Roman quarter called Simiez, where Queen Victoria stayed, a region almost as sedate and quiet as it was in her time, but considerably more crowded. From the heights above the city you can look down on a panorama as diverse as life itself. The streets of the shopkeepers and the bourgeoisie in the more modern part of town, the narrow rues of the Vieille Ville down by the sea where the Italians live, the faubourg of the port of Nice, which visitors rarely get to, and the region around the Place Massena, Centre de l'Animation, Cour de la Vie, which visitors seldom get away from. The main thoroughfare of the tourists' quarter is, of course, the Promenade des Anglais. It was in hotels along this boulevard that Isadora Duncan, Rudolph Valentino, Harry Sinclair lived when I was here before. In those 4, you have a colored postcard picture of this Centre de Vie Joyeuse, in the gay days before the Depression. It was an exciting winter, the winter of 1925. Nowadays, I more or less wander around, an outsider on a visit, but that season I was in the midst of the excitement. I think it was the Hôtel Roulet Anglais that I called up the night 12 years ago, when a wire came to us on the Tribune saying that Serge Yesenin, Isadora Duncan's former husband, had killed himself in Moscow. I was directed to get the great lady on the phone and find out what she had to say. It sometimes seemed to me that this nasty business of interviewing bereaved women was what editors figured me to be cut out for in my days as a newspaper man. The hotel reported that Miss Duncan was out and was not expected back before 1 o'clock in the morning. At a little after 1, ours was a morning newspaper, I got her on the phone. It came out that she had not yet heard about the death of the man with whom she had once led such a tumultuous life. I am sure I must have managed it all very badly. I was scared. I remember that she said nothing but no, 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 which she repeated a dozen times, and that finally she let the receiver fall. I called back the hotel, and speaking English to a puzzled French night clerk, shouted at him to do something about Miss Duncan. I have no idea what he did. I never saw Isadora Duncan. The next day, however, she granted interviews to other reporters, and, according to the Éclaireur, told them she felt sure that the poem which Yesenin is reported to have written in his own blood before he died was a poem to her. It was, I believe, on the Promenade des Anglais of this violent city that Isadora Duncan met her tragic and implausible end, when a scarf she was wearing trailed out of the car she was riding in, caught in a wheel, and choked her to death. I remember my phone call to Isadora Duncan all too clearly. I remember, too, how indestructibly healthy Valentino, who had only a few months to live, looked, and how Harry Sinclair, consenting warily to an interview, never once met my gaze, but stared at me out of the corner of his right eye. Nobody, however, so surely typified for me the faintly sinister fascination of this ancient city of the Phoceans as did a tall young Hindu who showed up silently and ominously in the little office of the Tribune one night. We had, a week before, advertised for a proofreader who knew English, and more than 50 persons had answered the ad, among them the young Hindu. They were an amazing group. A Belgian woman of 75, a former captain in the British Army, a Russian prince, a Scotch teacher, a French painter, all sorts and conditions of drifters and dreamers, the flotsam of 50 nations that you can raise with one signal or another from Simiez up on the hill to the steep streets of the old town by the sea. The editor had finally hired the former British Army man, but our Hindu, who appeared so softly out of the night, swore vehemently that it was he who had been hired. His dark stare was menacing. His perfect English had a dangerous edge. He was as straight-backed as a knife. "I have come for the job I was hired for," he said. "I am ready to start work." The editor, looking a little gray, said he had hired another man. "Oh, no, you haven't," said the Hindu quietly, and then shouted, "You hired me!" There was an unbearably long silence while he glared at each of us in turn. Then suddenly, turning on the editor again, he cried, "I know who you are and all about you. You are Lame-Leg Charlie, the dope fiend. Remember this, you haven't seen the last of me." And the door somehow opened behind him, and he was gone. The editor's name was not Charlie, he was not lame, and he didn't take dope. Our visitor's dark threat and his darker revelations, which were never cleared up, left us all a little shaken. It turned out that we had seen the last of our Hindu, but there never was a night that I didn't expect him to show up again, to wreak whatever peculiar vengeance it is that frustrated Hindu proofreaders go in for. I put this story in because Nice is like that. Nice is like this, too. One day in 1926, the Mistral, that violent and unpredictable wind from the Alps, came to town like a cavalcade of desperadoes, drunk and firing from both hips. It knocked over chimneys, ripped off signs, tore shutters loose from windows. I was walking with a lady in the Avenue Félix Faure when the terror descended. The lady walked, I am happy to say, very fast, so fast that we were able to step clear of 50 tons of bricks that suddenly roared and thundered to the pavement behind us. A high parapet surmounting a row of 6 one-story shops and forming a false second-story front had been toppled into the street by the wind, hurricaning behind it. I can still see with too great clarity the hand of a man who was killed in the wreckage, sticking up out of his tomb of bricks. A few moments before, I had been abreast of him. The lady, as I have said, was a fast walker. All this, then, past and present, is Nice, the capital of gaiety, the mother city of this bright shore of winter playgrounds. If I have made her seem perhaps a trifle too violent, I must make some amends. Nice has her quiet moments, her tranquil quartiers. She has even her proud memories of a holy visitation. It is nice to know, as you walk past the trim facade of the Hôtel Beau Rivage on the Quai des États-Unis, that on a November day 50 years ago, a certain obscure Frenchman named Martin decided to stay there one night with his two daughters, Céline and Thérèse. It is nice to know that from one of the wide windows, Thérèse Martin looked out on the palm trees and the deep blue of the Bay of the Angels. It is an enchanting view. Who knows what high resolve it may not have inspired in the young girl who was to become perhaps the most beloved of all the saints in the calendar to the people of her country, Sainte Thérèse de l'Enfant Jésus, France's little flower. Or you can walk into the peaceful old graveyard of the English Church of the Holy Trinity and ponder on the modest tombstone of a reverend English gentleman, Henry Francis Light of Lower Brixham in Devon, whose prayer that he might leave behind some blessing for his fellows, some fair trust to guide, to cheer, to elevate mankind, was answered in, of all places, Nice, where just before he died in November 1847, he was moved to write the surely immortal hymn that begins, "Abide with me, fast falls the eventide." Eventide in November falls very fast indeed in Nice. The darkness caught me one afternoon 2 months ago in the little graveyard, but not before I had seen the gleam of a small white card tacked to the church door. I went over to see if some fair trust might not be lettered on it. The living actuality of Nice abruptly overtook me, there in the gloaming, dispelling my mood of reverie. The card sadly announced that because of numerous thefts, the place of worship had to be kept locked. Visitors were requested to ask the sexton for the key. Journey to the Pyrenees. The day after the Czechs shot the two Germans in the spring of 1938, we were in a service flat off Piccadilly, having driven up from Dover 2 days before through alternating patches of rain and hawthorn blossom, sunshine and hail. McCulloch brought up the morning papers with the toast and coffee, and we read about the crisis. McCulloch looked worried. This, it came out, was only because he managed a building with 11 flats, all occupied, and illness among his servants had kept him understaffed. We talked about the drive up from Dover and about last year's weather. It hadn't rained once during the 2 weeks of Wimbledon. McCulloch said that if we should want tea later in the afternoon, just to give him a ring. After breakfast, we walked through Hyde Park, which was crowded because it was a warm, sunny day. People were lying on the grass, sitting on chairs, playing with their dogs. The place was full of Scotties and Spaniels and wire-haireds, chasing balls, barking at the swans. We idled along and caught the drift of conversations about the shocking defeat of England by Switzerland in a soccer game at Zurich, about the dark outlook for the English Davis Cup team against the Yugoslavs at Zagreb. Nobody was talking about Czechoslovakia. It reminded me of Juan Le Pen on the day after the Hitler coup in Vienna. The wisteria and the white iris had come into bloom. The weather was fine, and people were out in their brightest clothes, talking about this and that, shouting at their children, playing with their dogs. It reminded me of the day we had driven into Luchon, too, on the edge of the Spanish War. This story is mainly about driving to Luchon and the quiet we ran into there. The going in Gaul has vastly improved since the year 218 B.C., when Hannibal took a month to push his 37 elephants from the valley of the Rhone to the pass of the Little St. Bernard on his celebrated journey from Cartagena to the outskirts of Rome. Nowadays, on the fine French roads, you could get from Juan Le Pen to Luchon between sunrise and sunset if you had to, and you wouldn't have to go as fast as Prince Bernard of Holland, who recently did 90 miles an hour between Cannes and Avignon for the hell of it, burning out the bearings of his special racing car, so that new ones had to be sent to him by plane from Rome. We took 4 days getting to Luchon, which is fast enough through this storied country. There hadn't been any rain to speak of on Cap d'Antibes for months, and people had been going to the little chapel of La Garoupe to pray for it. They weren't worried about war, they were worried about drought. The morning we started out, the sky was cloudy, but there was a south wind which Maria, cook and prophet, said would prevail and keep off the rain, prayers or no prayers. The gods crossed her up when we got into the Estoril. The wind shifted into the east, and the Roman ruins in Fréjus were soaked when we passed through. The rain freshened up the white and purple lilacs and the trolley tracks of Toulon, making them fine for skidding. The motorists of Provence perpetuate the violent old traditions of this beau pays. One of them, in Toulon, tried to pass a moving trolley car on a wet, narrow street, banged into a curb, banged into the car, got tagged in the spare tire as he forged ahead onto the tracks, but managed to keep on going in a series of swooping skids. The driver and the watman, as the French so wonderfully call motormen, kept shouting vilifications at each other throughout the whole scene. There is no fear can silence the indignant volubility of a French motorist, or even make him keep both hands on the wheel. The thing to do is stop when you sense these things happening, even a block away. Ours is another madness set to a different rhythm, and no American can hope to comprehend the highly specialized patterns woven so suddenly and so magically on the shuttle of French roads. One should lie low when the French begin to bang into each other, and wait until the desperate design is disentangled and the highway is quiet again. The roads of France are notable for their straightness and their sound surfacing. Outside of towns there are few blind crossings. You almost never see a pack of cars, nose to tail, chasing each other over the highways. 10 miles out of Paris in any direction, you virtually have the road to yourself. But the French drive always at an angry rate of speed. They blow their horns wildly for crossings, but never slow down, and their favorite sport is passing a car that's passing a car on a 3-lane road. They recognize no courtesies of the road and are confused if you extend any. Thus it is that they can hold their own with any nation in number and quality of crack-ups. Winding up back of Toulon, we got into moist spears of snow that turned to large, lazy flakes on the mountain top. On the other side, in true Provence, we came down onto dry roads under a summer sun. Here you begin to see at the branching of highways the exciting names of Avignon and Tarascon and Beaucaire. This is the land of the troubadours and the Mistral, of Cézanne and bullfights, of nightingales and war. For all its blood and scars and glory, it is an innocent-looking land to drive through, flat and indolent, lonely and a touch scrubby. There are red poppies along the road and cypresses, but mainly your eye is caught by the plane trees, whose tops the French cut off in the first months of the year whenever they get around to it. Some of them look like the gnarled hands of old women. Some are as stark and nude as telegraph poles. On others, topped back earlier, irrepressible new branches have begun to shoot straight upward from the ravaged trunks, like thousands of long green candles. It is a mystic tree in a strange country. It was raining again when we went through Aix-en-Provence, but in Arles, only 40 miles away, which you reach over roads that are as quiet as roads on the moon, there hadn't been any rain for 6 months. The air was clear and keen, like October air, and everything had a high crystal sharpness and looked brand new. It was the same in Nîmes, where, under glass in the Maison Carrée, a handful of Americans have accomplished a curious kind of immortality. Showcases here contain a collection of Roman coins and an assortment of modern coins of various nations. There is a 1909 Lincoln penny, the gift one is assured of Mr. Herbert Claiborne Pill, Jr. There is also a tiny gold California quarter, presented on the 20th of October, 1903, by Mrs. Frederick F. Thompson, and a $3 gold piece of 1854 added to the collection by Daisy M. Orlman, M.D., in memory of her visit to Nîmes on the 17th of March, 1904. In this region, in any season, you see the hurrying Hudsons and Lincolns of American tourists, intent on taking in, all in one day, Arles, Nîmes, Aigues-Mortes, Tarascon, the Sainte-Maries, the Pont du Gard, the dead town of Les Baux, the bridge in Avignon, and the old church in Saint-Gilles. Americans have a strange inability to spot each other in a foreign land. I was frequently complimented on my English by ladies and gentlemen from Oregon, New Jersey, Virginia, and even Ohio. "You speak English very well," they invariably told me. "Is because," I liked to reply, lapsing into my natural accent, "I am living for 43 years in New York and Ohio." "Think of that," they always said. I didn't get to talk to the Clevelanders, whose bright new car I saw in the ancient city under the Black Mountain, but I imagine they would have been astonished at my accent. Their license plates bore the announcement of the 150th anniversary of the opening of the Northwest Territory. The proud boast looked a little pale inside the walls of Carcassonne, and somehow reminded you of Shirley Temple cutting in on May Robeson with an anecdote about the old days. To get to Carcassonne, for I am ahead of myself, tourists usually go through Montpellier without stopping, but this can be a great mistake. There was a tremendous street carnival going on when we reached there, the largest I have seen in France, with at least 40 merry-go-rounds and similar dangerous contraptions, and 2 or 3 unforgettable sideshows. On the painted canvas walls of one of these, the Sirens of the Sea were advertised. First time in France, only 50 centimes to get in. Inside, in a tank 6 feet by 4 and perhaps 5 feet deep, an enormous young woman with gold teeth splashed around in the water, wearing a faded blue bathing suit and a white rubber cap, and wrestling with a snake perhaps 4 feet long, which was either dead or, worn out by the unequal struggle, had fainted. In an adjoining tent, labeled Spectacle de New York, one was privileged for 50 centimes to gaze upon the various methods by which gangsters are punished in the jails of that cruel city, the electric chair, the Iron Maiden, and the Third Degree, which last proved to be an iron-spiked battle axe. But what Montpellier will always bring to my mind first, I suppose, is an item I found in a copy of the London Times, which I managed to buy there. While the band was playing at the changing of the guard in the Grand Quadrangle of Windsor Castle yesterday, the remarkable news story announced, a pigeon settled on the bearskin of one of the guardsmen. The guardsman managed to shake it off, but it instantly flew onto the pack of another of the guard, and refused to move until the company sergeant major advanced upon it. It then flew away. An article in an adjoining column announced with equal composure that the army of General Franco had reached the sea. From Carcassonne, a road runs northwest through the Cassoulet country to Toulouse. But for Luchon, you take the southwest route through the Pâté de Foie Gras country. Just outside the hamlet of Fangeau, you see the Pyrenees for the first time, like clouds in the sky, white and still and far away. You couldn't reach them before lunch, and the place to stop for that was the Hôtellerie Barbacane in Foix. The waiters were dressed in bright costumes of the region, and one of them told us that he had fought side by side with the Americans for 4 months during the First World War. He also told us that the sporting way to get to the next town, Saint-Giron, was by way of a narrow mountain road, C-17, a route both belle and sauvage. We went along it till we came to 2 workmen who told us we couldn't get through without chains on account of the snow, so we turned around, a feat on C-17, and went back to the national road that parallels the Pyrenees a little farther north. This road brought us to Montrejoux, where we turned sharply south for Luchon and the Spanish border, and rode toward one of the finest peaks of the range. Hemingway has written that in the Spanish shadow of the Pyrenees, which Republican militiamen and civilians began to crawl out of in March by way of the Val d'Aran, military positions could be held by determined graduates of any good girls' finishing school. It is interesting to note that in the first Catalonian campaign that threatened the stability of the world, 2,156 years ago, the native tribes of the region held off the advance of the Carthaginian army for several months, destroyed a fourth of it, but finally let Hannibal fight through to the mountains. The tribesmen of 218 BC had been promised help from Rome. One of the fondest speculations of military historians is whether Hannibal could have battled his way from the Ebro to the Pyrenees against Roman legions. When help never came, the Catalonians of 2,000 years ago probably felt as discouraged as the defenders of 1938 in the face of natural allies who seemed resigned to the triumph of Franco. I had expected to have to wind and climb through Luchon, but the road is straight and flat through the valley of a little stream called the Pique. All my expectations of Luchon turned out to be wrong. I had looked for crowds and turmoil, but there was no rumor of either. The French papers had been full of the flight over the mountains of anywhere from 4,000 to 8,000 people. Special writers had been sending out from Luchon the conflicting, patchy, and excited stories that French journalists do on such occasions. It is 25 miles from Montrejeu into Luchon. A few sleepy white oxen were to be seen on the road, and girls on bicycles, and French soldiers wandering around in aimless groups of 3 or 4. There was no sign of a refugee and no more feel of tension than you'd find in an apple orchard. The trees wore their new green, the Pique burbled merrily along, and the mountains were as cold and untroubled as stars. A clock was striking 7 when we drove into Luchon, but it was still bright daylight. The town was quiet and almost empty, a resort out of season. There were only a few people on the long, drowsy main street, a woman carrying a loaf of bread, a man trying to ride a bicycle and lead an unhappy calf at the same time, 2 army officers chatting and laughing. All the many hotels on this street except one were closed, and in the lobby of that one a single lonely figure moved slowly about. In a barber shop, the barbers lay relaxed in their chairs, one with a newspaper over his face listening to a loud radio. In the doorway of a deserted tabac, a girl watched the man and the calf with an unamused stare. A couturier's shop named Mary Jane and a bar called La Refuge slept behind their iron shutters. We drove around a big vacant square till we came to the hotel we had picked out in the Michelin guide. It had been marked open all year. Luchon had 2 seasons, winter and summer. In between times there was nothing going on. It was like an abandoned ballroom. There was no sign of life about the big hotel, which consisted of 2 5-story buildings joined together. I got out and tried one of the doors, but couldn't open it. A little boy of about 8 appeared briefly in another door and gave us a surprised look. We went through that door into a vast, cold, and gloomy lobby. It was obvious that there were no guests in the place and hadn't been for a long time. The day was fading, and the lobby seemed to get larger and darker and colder as we stood there. Parts of the gloom moved, and they turned out to be an old woman and a younger woman. We found out that they ran the place. A porter silently detached himself from the darkness and brought in our bags. A chambermaid, whose white cap moved like a cloud in the night, led us up an enormous staircase to a big room that had been shuttered for months. She opened the shutters and went away, and came back with some firewood and a vase of lilacs. The room got fairly warm after a while. The man who had brought in our bags served dinner in our room at 8:30, having changed into freshly pressed waiter's clothes. I had peeked into the big dining room, and it was as cold as a skating rink. The waiter said his name was Francois, and that he was a Spaniard. Francois brought a map of Spain with the coffee and explained about the refugees. He said everything was so quiet because the border had been closed 2 days before. We had just missed the excitement. The French had handled the refugees with speed and competence. There weren't any more of them to be seen. Most of them had been put on trains to be sent back to Spain. The others were being taken care of in Toulouse, he thought, or somewhere. He had talked to some of the refugees as they came through. They were war-weary and discouraged. They said they had wandered around for weeks without seeing any officers. They had had enough. Francois's bias was anti-leftist. He said that he did not belong to any party, he was not for either side, but what Spain needed was a strong hand. With Franco's victory there would come a strong hand. Mussolini and Hitler would have no say at all. Another hostile border for France? Nothing to worry about. Everything would be all right. There would be no fascism, just a strong hand that would make everything fine. Francois talked like a lot of people you used to hear chattering at tea parties in Europe. Only a miracle could win for the leftists, and there would be no miracle, said Francois. The next morning was bright and clear, and we drove on toward the border until the road began to narrow and crawl up the mountain, and we couldn't go any farther. We drove back through Luchon, passing one or two ox carts groaning along at a mile an hour under heavy loads of tree trunks. It was high noon in Luchon, but the town was still asleep. We stopped for lunch in Thurber, where our waiter spoke English with a fine American accent. He wasn't interested in what we had seen in Luchon or what had been going on there. What he wanted to know was whether the Brevoort Hotel still existed in New York. He said his father had been chef there 20 years before. We told him the Brevoort was fine. From Thurber, it was an easy drive to Lourdes, the town of miracles, and around there we began to pick up tourists' cars again. It is interesting to find that Michelin, like Francois, does not believe in miracles, or anyway doesn't say anything about them. At the end of the information given about a town in the guidebook, you often find a mention of its specialty. For Lourdes, it says, Spécialité chocolat. After CATO, what? It may be true that the trains run on schedule in Italy now, but the guards at grade crossings are not taking any chances. They run their gates down anywhere from 15 to 40 minutes before a train comes along. I have often smoked half a pack of cigarettes waiting for a train at a crossing. Ox carts and mule carts pile up despondently, but you do not see many cars. Gasoline costs nearly 70 cents a gallon in Italy, and few Italians can afford to drive cars. This is fortunate, for Italians drive as if Hannibal were after them in a Duesenberg, and on crowded roads would soon kill each other off.